Hello students, welcome to Legacy IAS Academy. Today we are going to discuss about the recently released World Economic Outlook report by the International Monetary Fund. In this particular video, we are going to discuss in the context of this report that what does IMF projects in the coming months and even years for both the global economy as well as the Indian economy. So first of all, let us try to understand slightly about the World Economic Outlook. So actually it was released last week by the International Monetary Fund, and every year, that is annually we can say, IMF releases two World Economic Outlook reports. Both of these reports, one of them is released in April and one of them is released in the October. However, apart from the release of these two reports, International Monetary Fund actually also provide updates to these reports. One update is provided in the January and the other update is provided in the July. Now, the last report that obviously was released during the month of October, it basically talked about the inequality among the nations. Inequality among nations, here World Economic Forum actually has emphasized that if you compare the developed and advanced economy with the emerging and developing economy, there is a very large scale inequality both in terms of the growth prospects as well as in the terms of the employment generations. However, this particular report, as expected, since the Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a most important geopolitical phenomena that has happened in this particular year after October. So basically it focuses upon how this particular war is going to impact both the global growth as well as the growth of India. So what are the important points about this report? So first of all, it has says that due to the impact of this war and the growing resource crisis as well as the disruption in the supply chain all across the world, it estimates that the global growth will slow down from the 6.1% observed in year 2021 to almost 3.6% in 2022, and even it will slow down further in 2023. Beyond 2023, it says that the potential does not look good, it is a grim, and it will even decelerate from 3.6% to as far as low as 3.3%. And this drag on output is expected to be more salient in emerging market and developing economy. This is very important observation that has been made by World Economic Outlook and IMF. It has says that the growth slowdown that is happening all across the world, this slowdown will be more intense in the emerging market and developing economies as compared to the advanced economies. And what will the impact of this on India? So obviously, as the global growth slows down, it will dampen the demand for the Indian exports, and as the demand for Indian export decline, we can expect that Indian economy will also see, or India's GDP growth will also see a shrinkage as compared to the expected recovery. Now let us try to understand about few important takeaways from this particular report. So first of all, it talks about the average output gap projections. So what is the output gap? Now output gap refers to the gap or difference between the actual GDP growth and the expected GDP potential. So in this output gap projections also, if you compare this advanced economies with the emerging market and developing economies in which India lies, here we can see the output gap is much higher in case of emerging market as compared to the advanced economies. So that does not bode well for the India. Now the second important takeaway is with reference to the employment losses. So here also we compare the emerging market and developing economies with the advanced economies and USA. We say the employment losses are relatively much higher as compared to the pre-pandemic level in the emerging market as compared to the advanced market. So here also it is expected that India will have to create a much higher number of jobs, much higher number of employment as compared to the advanced economies. The third and most important takeaway is with respect to the recovery of the GDP growth. So here we have two lines. The red line represents the GDP level or the GDP trend of emerging market and developing economies, while the blue straight line, solid line, represents the GDP trend of advanced economies. So this solid red line represents the GDP trend in the pre-pandemic level. So if you compare this with the dotted line that represents the GDP trend in the post-pandemic level, here we can see the differences in the case of emerging markets are much higher as compared to differences in the advanced economies. So what does it tells us? It tells us that the GDP growth that is happening in emerging markets, including India, is much more laggard as compared to the pre-pandemic GDP trend as compared to the advanced markets like USA, European Union and United Kingdom, etc. So this is also going to be a severe challenge that India will have to face in bridging this particular gap. Now coming to the most important observation made by IMF in terms of inflation. So IMF has clearly stated that due to the disruptive impact of war that is going on in Ukraine, the several commodities, the prices have steeply skyrocketed or steeply increased, and this has caused a massive surge in the inflation level all across the world. The most important effect we see in the case of oil prices, and as we know that as oil prices rises up, obviously it will cause rise in price of all other goods. It also because the transportation cost of all the commodities goods will significantly increase. Apart from that, IMF also have said that if we talk about the inflation in the coming years, we can see the risks of increasing inflations are large, and the risk in the growth of GDP is to the downside. So basically it says that in the coming year inflation will rise up while the global growth will dampen, and this has been given in terms of data, where the IMF says that if we look at the advanced economies, their GDP growth rate will be their inflation growth rate will be somewhere about 5.7%, that is 1.8% higher before the war situation. Similarly, if you look at the emerging market economies, their inflation rate is to be expected to be somewhere about 8.7%, that is almost 2.8 percentage point higher than the pre-war scenario. Now what about the India's outlook as far as the growth is concerned? So there are two ways how we can look at the India's outlook. First, if you look at here the projections, so the India's GDP growth projections as per the recent estimate is believed to be 8.2%. So 8.2% if you compare with the GDP growth rate of all other countries, including the advanced economies and the other emerging economies, India's expected GDP growth rate is highest. For example, you compare this with advanced economies, their GDP growth rate is 3.3%. So India's growth rate will be two times higher than that. So also if you look at United States, so the GDP growth rate of India is also 2 times higher than the United States. So this is the kind of a positive way of looking at the data. However, the right approach, apart from that, if you look at the critical approach we can see from here that this GDP growth rate has been downgraded by 0.8 percentage points for India. That means the earlier GDP growth rate was somewhere about 9%, that has been declined to 8.2%. So that is something a kind of negative way of looking at the things. So in between positive and negative, what is the right approach of looking at this particular data for India's growth? So this is something that economics is something that is called as required run rate approach. That is a term that has been borrowed from the cricket. So what is the required run rate approach? So for understanding this, we have to understand two data. One is the share of a particular country in the GDP, global GDP, and second, the share of a particular country in the global population or world population. So let us compare United States and India. So if you look at United States, its share in the global GDP is almost 37.4%, while its share in the global population is only 30.8%. That means we can say with respect to United States, its share in the global GDP is higher than its share in the global population. Now let us compare this figure with India's. So if you look at India's, its share in the global GDP is just 12.1%. However, its share in the global population is 21%. That means India's share in the world's population is almost 10 percentage points higher, 9 percentage points higher than its share in GDP. So basically what it means that the countries which are having higher share of GDP as compared to population are generally the prosperous countries, because there the employment rate is higher, there the salary is higher, the wages are higher, and that is why the people or the citizens of those countries are able to enjoy a much higher level of life. However, in countries where the population percentage or the contribution of nation's population in world population is higher as compared to nation's population in GDP, there relatively the lifestyle, or we can say everything GDP per capita is much more lower, and that is why these countries need to have a much higher rate of growth so they can catch up with the advanced economies. And here in this context, we can understand that if you compare the 3.3% growth of USA, that it's sufficient enough for the USA to maintain its lifestyle as compared to India's growth GDP growth rate of 8.2%. So that is how we can understand that what this whole data and the observations of IMF means in both global, context of global economy as well as India's economy. That is all for today. Thank you very much.